The year is 1654. The air in colonial Virginia hangs heavy, not only with the sharp, earthy scent of curing tobacco, but with the unspoken weight of a single question, a question whispered among the rows of plants, a dangerous inquiry that would irrevocably alter the lives of three men, stripping two of their freedom and condemning the third to a legal darkness that would stretch forward through generations yet unborn. This was no ordinary question. It was a direct challenge to the fragile fabric of an emerging society, a confrontation with truth too inconvenient, too scandalous, to be acknowledged openly, a truth that threatened to tear through custom, reputation, and law itself. Why does the master's youngest son have my brother's eyes, his mouth, his hands? The man who dared to voice this impossible question was an African servant named John Punch. The man who heard it, the plantation overseer, would soon find his own life fatally entangled in its implications. Within 48 hours of that whispered sentence, one man would be dead, his secret sealed beneath the unforgiving soil of Virginia, and another would be cast into a legal abyss, becoming the first human being formally condemned to lifelong servitude in English America. What the colonial court buried in 1640 was not merely a body. It was a chilling blueprint for an institution that would consume millions, a silent decree that would shape a nation for centuries to come. Before we descend further into the harrowing story of John Punch and the question whose devastating simplicity altered American history forever, I need you to do something. If you're listening from Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere across the United States, take a moment to leave a comment below telling us which state you're from. This is not just a story. It is a foundational fragment of forgotten American history, a shadow from our collective past that deserves to be pulled into the light. And hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear has been painstakingly reconstructed from colonial court records hidden away for nearly 400 years. A truth you will not find in any conventional textbook. Now allow me to carry you back to a world long vanished. A world where the color of one's skin had not yet been fully codified as the ultimate determinant of destiny, but where one man's desperate pursuit of truth will begin carving that line, sharp and unforgiving, into blood and law alike. Virginia, 1638. The colony was still fragile, an ambitious experiment barely 3 decades removed from the desperate struggles of Jamestown's first settlers. It was a land of stark contrasts, where breathtaking natural beauty existed alongside the brutal realities of survival. Tobacco plantations clung precariously to the fertile banks of the James River and the Chesapeake Bay, each one an isolated outpost of English ambition carved into an immense and untamed wilderness. Jamestown, the fledgling capital, was less a city than a loose scattering of rough-hewn wooden buildings, dirt paths that dissolved into mud after every rain, and a constant hum of labor driven by Europe's insatiable appetite for tobacco. Here, English settlers, African servants, and European indentured laborers worked side by side, their sweat mingling in the rich soil beneath a legal system that, for all its crude inconsistencies, still made surprisingly little distinction between them based solely on origin. For most, servitude was understood as temporary. Contracts were signed, terms were served, and freedom was granted, often accompanied by a small allotment of land and basic tools, whether one hailed from the crowded alleys of London or the distant shores of West Africa. The Virginia summers were oppressive, the air thick and suffocating, clinging to skin and clothing like a damp shroud. Mosquitoes bred in vast marshes and stagnant pools, rising in relentless swarms at dusk, their high-pitched whine a constant, maddening presence for anyone working the fields. The tobacco plants, the colony's lifeblood, grew tall and broad-leafed, their green expanse stretching toward the shimmering ribbon of the James River. Each autumn, merchant ships with towering masts and billowing sails arrived, eager to carry the precious harvest back to the bustling markets of England. The soil, though fertile and promising, demanded unrelenting labor. Clearing, planting, weeding, harvesting, and finally the delicate, time-consuming process of curing. It was work that aged men before their time, carving lines of exhaustion and hardship deep into their faces. John Punch arrived in Virginia sometime around 1630, his journey a harrowing testament to human endurance. He had been taken from the West African coast, a land of vibrant cultures and ancient traditions, aboard a ship whose name has been lost to history. The transatlantic crossing was a nightmare that stretched on for nearly 3 months, a blur of darkness, suffocating heat, the stench of unwashed bodies packed too tightly together, and a relentless, hypnotic crash of the ocean against the hull. He was not considered a slave upon his arrival. The very word, with its implication of permanent, inherited bondage, held no clear legal meaning in English Virginia at the time. John Punch was classified as a servant, bound by a contract he had not willingly entered, to a planter named Hugh Gwynn. Gwynn was a man in his early 40s, a younger son from a modest gentry family in Wales. Like so many others, he had come to Virginia chasing the fortune denied to him by England's rigid class structure. He was practical rather than sentimental, neither openly cruel nor notably kind, driven by a single consuming obsession, making his plantation profitable. In a colony where tobacco prices rose and collapsed without warning, where fortunes could be made or destroyed in a single season, Hugh Gwynn's ambition was both his greatest strength and his defining trait. He lived with his wife, Eleonora, a pale, reserved woman who rarely ventured beyond the walls of the main house, and their 3 children. 2 daughters had been sent back to England for schooling, a common practice among wealthier planters, and a son, Thomas, who had only recently returned from abroad. Punch labored in the fields alongside 2 other servants, men who, despite their vastly different backgrounds, were bound together by the shared condition of indentured servitude. One was James Gregory, a Scotsman with a pronounced scar slashed across his left cheek, a memento from a childhood mishap. Gregory was a talker by nature, a man who filled a quiet their shared cabin with booming stories of his homeland, tales of the Scottish Highlands, of clan rivalries and ancient loyalties that had eventually driven him across the ocean. He had signed his indenture contract in Glasgow, a desperate attempt to escape a blood feud that would almost certainly have claimed his life had he stayed. He was 28, with fiery red hair beginning to thin at the crown and hands permanently hardened by years of punishing labor. Gregory possessed a volatile temper, but an even quicker, infectious laugh, and even the first to extend friendship to Punch when the African servant arrived at Gwynn's plantation. The other man was Victor, a Dutchman whose surname, like so many others swallowed by history, was never recorded. Victor was Gregory's opposite in every way, a quiet, inward man who spoke only when necessary, guarding his thoughts and emotions with deliberate care. He came from Amsterdam, a city of canals and commerce, and had arrived in Virginia as part of a failed colonial venture organized by the Dutch West India Company. When that effort collapsed, Victor, burdened by debt, sold himself into servitude to settle his accounts. He was 32, tall and spare, with pale blue eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him while revealing nothing of his inner life. In the evenings, Victor had a peculiar habit of carving small wooden figures, his knife moving with calm, practiced precision as animals and faces emerged from scraps of discarded wood, a quiet testament to a hidden artistry. Punch, then in his mid-20s, was lean and powerfully built, his reserved demeanor concealing a sharp intelligence that made him invaluable to Hugh Gwynn. He possessed an instinctive understanding of the land, able to read subtle shifts in weather, anticipate the ideal moment for harvesting tobacco, and repair broken tools with an almost intuitive skill. He learned English with remarkable speed, absorbing the language from fellow servants and the curt commands barked by overseers in the fields. Though he kept largely to himself, he commanded a quiet respect among the laborers. Gregory, with his characteristic perceptiveness, once remarked that Punch seemed to notice things others overlooked. Victor, ever laconic, simply called him the Watcher. The Gwynn plantation, modest by the standards of the colony's wealthiest planters, was nonetheless a self-contained world. 40 acres of cleared land stretched around the main house, built of wood and brick, flanked by 2 servant cabins and the essential tobacco barn, where harvested leaves were slowly transformed through curing. Behind the house, a vegetable garden carefully tended by Eleanor Gwynn and an elderly servant woman named Bess provided daily sustenance. Nearby, a small orchard of apple trees, planted when the plantation was first established, offered both fruit and shade. From the fields, the James River could be seen, wide, slow-moving, a ribbon of brown water reflecting the vast Virginia sky. It was a constant reminder of the distant world beyond their isolation, a world connected by the ships that plied its waters. Yet beneath the routine of labor and the steady rhythm of the seasons, something else festered on the plantation. A subtle, creeping unease gnawed at John Punch during every waking hour. Hugh Gwynn's youngest son, a boy of about 12 named Thomas, had recently returned from England, where he had been sent to live with relatives. The boy was unmistakably English in his bearing, with light brown hair and a narrow, aristocratic face. But his eyes, his mouth, even the shape of his hands, they were unmistakable. They belonged to someone else. Punch had a brother. His name was Kofi. They had been taken from the same village in West Africa, torn from their family by the brutal efficiency of slave traders. Separated on the coast, sold to different ships, they had arrived in Virginia 2 years before Punch himself. After his arrival, Punch spent agonizing months searching for any trace of Kofi, asking every African servant he encountered whether they had seen a man with his brother's distinctive face, his resonant voice, his particular way of moving. He found him in the spring of 1636. Kofi was working on a neighboring plantation owned by a man named William Evans. Evans was a formidable presence in the colony, a wealthy planter, a member of the Colonial Assembly, and a man of considerable influence who owned more than 200 acres of prime tobacco land. The brothers' reunion was painfully brief, a stolen hour on a rare Sunday afternoon when both plantations granted their servants a precious day of rest. They sat beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree marking the boundary between the two properties and spoke in their native language, words pouring out in a torrent of emotion, memory, and shared grief. Kofi had changed. His hands, once smooth and strong, were now scarred and hardened by ceaseless fieldwork. His face was gaunt, etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, and his eyes, those deep, dark pools Punch knew so well, held a sorrow that defied expression. Kofi told him of life on the Evans plantation, the endless labor, the constant presence of the overseer, and the grand main house where William Evans lived with his wife, Margaret. Margaret, Kofi said, was a woman of striking beauty, but there were whispers that she was also profoundly lonely. He did not say much more about Margaret Evans, but when he spoke her name, his voice shifted slightly and a fleeting shadow crossed his face. The change unsettled Punch deeply, stirring an unease he could not name. Punch saw his brother only twice more after that first meeting. The second time was in the autumn of 1636, another brief, clandestine encounter at the boundary line. Kofi seemed more withdrawn, more troubled, his words sparse. The third and final meeting came in the spring of 1637. Kofi's hands were even more scarred, his face thinner, yet his eyes remained the same, dark, deep, and filled with an unspeakable sorrow. He confessed to Punch that he was afraid something was happening on the Evans plantation, something he couldn't quite explain, something that felt dangerous and profoundly wrong. And then, just as suddenly as he had re-entered Punch's life, Kofi was gone. 3 months later, he was dead. The official cause, as recorded in the Colonial Register, was fever, a common enough affliction during the Virginia summer, when oppressive heat and swarms of mosquitoes carried sickness that could fell even a strong man within days. But Punch heard whispers, fragments of hushed conversations among the servants, rumors that spread to the quarters like illness itself. Kofi, it was said, had been seen near the main house late at night in the weeks leading up to his death. Margaret Evans, according to those same whispers, had been heard weeping uncontrollably in the days before Kofi died. And then, just like that, he was gone, buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the Evans plantation. His life reduced to a single, chilling line in the colonial records, African servant, deceased. When Thomas Gwynn returned from England in 1638, Punch saw his brother's face reflected in the boy's features with visceral, almost physical shock. It was impossible, a notion that defied logic, law, and the rigid social order of the colony. And yet it was undeniably, terrifyingly real. The precise shape of the eyes, the subtle curve of the mouth, the elegant length of the fingers. They were Kofi's. Punch said nothing at first. He watched, he waited, and the longer he observed, the more an inescapable, horrifying certainty began to take hold within him. Thomas Gwynn was a quiet child, unusually so for his age. He was studious and serious, with a deep love of books that set him apart from most boys in the colony, who were far more interested in riding, hunting, and proving their toughness. He had spent 5 formative years in England, living with his mother's relatives in a small, idyllic village in Kent. He returned to Virginia not only with a trunk filled with leather-bound books, but with mind shaped by ideas of a wider world, one far removed from the raw, untamed wilderness of the colony. He was unfailingly polite to the servants, never cruel. And he possessed a peculiar habit of watching them at their work with thoughtful, almost searching expression that deeply unsettled Punch. The boy's eyes were dark, darker than his father's, darker even than his mother's. His hands were long and graceful, his fingers almost too delicate for the brutal demands of plantation life. And his mouth, when he allowed himself a rare, fleeting smile, curved in a way Punch had seen only once before on his brother's face. Driven by an instinct he could neither suppress nor ignore, Punch began to ask careful, subtle questions. He spoke with other servants, especially those who had lived in Virginia longer, those who understood the colony's intricate web of gossip and unspoken knowledge, the whispers that traveled between plantations like an unseen, persistent wind. From them, he learned that Margaret Evans had indeed given birth to a son in 1626, a boy who had been sent to England almost immediately after his birth, supposedly to be raised by distant relatives. He learned that William Evans, the powerful planter, had been conspicuously absent from his plantation for several months before the boy was born, traveling to England on what had been described as important business. And with chilling certainty, Punch learned that Margaret Evans had been seen in the company of Kofi, the African servant, during the months leading up to the child's conception. Then came the final, devastating piece. Kofi had died just 3 months after Thomas Gwynn, the boy with Kofi's eyes, returned to Virginia. The fragments were all there now, scattered and incomplete, yet Punch could see the terrible shape they formed. The truth, raw and unvarnished, was impossible, dangerous, and utterly unthinkable within the rigid social structure of colonial Virginia. It was late September 1638, and the tobacco harvest had reached its fevered peak. The air hung thick with humidity, heavy and unmoving, a suffocating blanket draped over the land. The field stretched endlessly beneath a pale, washed-out blue sky, buzzing with the relentless drone of insects, a constant, maddening symphony of summer. The sun beat down with near malicious intensity, baking the earth and searing the skin, turning already punishing labor into an almost unbearable ordeal. Punch, Gregory, and Victor worked side by side, their movements synchronized by years of shared toil. They cut the broad, sticky tobacco leaves and carried them into the cavernous curing barn, hanging them carefully in long rows. The leaves were heavy, coated in viscous sap that stained their hands dark brown and soaked their rough clothing with sweat. The air was thick with a sweet, earthy scent of drying tobacco, a smell that clung stubbornly to skin and hair alike. From a meager shade of a gnarled oak at the edge of the field, the overseer watched them. His name was Robert Sweet. He was a man forged in the crucible of colonial hardship. Thin, wiry, with a face like weathered leather and eyes perpetually narrowed against the sun. When he chose to speak, his voice was sharp and cutting, capable of slicing clean to the drone of the fields. In his late 30s, Sweet had once been an indentured servant himself, a man who had clawed his way into authority through ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty to Hugh Gwynn. He carried a stout wooden stick, not usually for beating. Gwynn, for all his pragmatism, did not condone open brutality, but for pointing for emphasis, for asserting absolute control. A wide-brimmed hat, darkened by sweat, shielded his face from the relentless sun, and his eyes were always moving, always scanning, always calculating. Robert Sweet had cultivated a formidable reputation throughout the colony. He was known as a man who delivered results, who could extract more labor from servants than nearly any other overseer, who possessed an uncanny ability to sense trouble before it fully surfaced. He was also whispered to be a keeper of secrets, a man who knew intimate details about planters and their families, knowledge that, if revealed, could shatter reputations and ruin lives. Sweet was not a man to be crossed. Every soul on the Gwyn plantation understood this unspoken truth. Implicitly, Punch had maintained a profound silence throughout the morning, his thoughts a violent storm beneath his calm exterior. But the question, a dangerous, burning ember, had been smoldering inside him for months, threatening to consume him entirely. It was the kind of question that could earn a man a brutal whipping, or something far worse. And yet, he could no longer contain it. Earlier that morning, he had seen Thomas Gwyn strolling through the fields, his dark eyes calmly observing the servants at their labor, his long, delicate fingers absently turning the pages of a book. That sight had been the final, unbearable catalyst. In every subtle line of the boy's face, in every unconscious gesture, Punch saw his brother Kofi. The crushing weight of the secret, the impossible truth, became too heavy to carry any longer. As Sweet's shadow, long and distorted in the late afternoon sun, passed beside him, Punch straightened his aching back. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and spoke. His voice was low but steady, filled with a quiet, desperate resolve. "Mr. Sweet," he said, the words cutting through the endless drone of insects, "I need to ask you something." Sweet stopped abruptly and turned, slowly. His eyes narrowed with instant suspicion. Nearby, Gregory and Victor froze mid-motion, and two other servants, a young Englishman named Peter and an older African man named Samuel, halted their work as well, every gaze fixed on Punch. The air seemed to grow impossibly heavy, the buzzing of insects suddenly louder, almost deafening in the silence that followed. "What is it, Punch?" Sweet asked. His voice was flat, stripped of any discernible emotion, a dangerous calm. Punch hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second. Then, fueled by desperation, he spoke the words that would shatter his life. "The boy, young Master Thomas. Why does he look exactly like my brother?" The sentence hung in the oppressive air like poisonous smoke. Gregory's eyes widened in disbelief and terror, and he instinctively stepped back, as if distance might shield him from the catastrophe unfolding. Victor's hand tightened around his tobacco knife until his knuckles turned white. Peter and Samuel exchanged quick, fearful glances, their faces visibly draining of color. Sweet's face, pale with shock, flushed rapidly into a deep, furious red. He took a slow, menacing step toward Punch. His stout stick, usually used for pointing or emphasis, lifted slightly, a silent threat. "What did you say?" Sweet whispered. The words were barely audible, yet they carried a chilling weight that pressed down on everyone within earshot. Despite the tremor now running through his body, Punch did not retreat. He met Sweet's gaze without flinching. "My brother Kofi," Punch said. "He worked for Mr. Evans. He died last year. The boy has his face, his hands, his eyes. I need to know why." Sweet's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching violently along his cheek. He cast a quick, frantic glance across the field, as if checking who else might have overheard the incendiary words. The other servants pretended to resume their labor, but their rigid movements betrayed them. Every one of them was listening, their expressions caught between fear and grim curiosity. Sweet leaned in close to Punch, his voice dropping into a venomous hiss, barely audible above the insects. "You don't ask questions like that. Punch. You don't even think them. Do you understand me? I just want to know," Punch began, his voice cracking despite his effort to steady it. "You want to know?" Sweet's voice suddenly rose, ripping apart the fragile calm. Several servants flinched, recoiling from the outburst. "You want to know why a white boy looks like your dead brother? You think that's a question you get to ask. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, burned now with dangerous fury. Punch said nothing. He simply held Sweet's gaze, a silent challenge flickering in his eyes. Sweet's hand tightened around the stick, visibly shaking. Without another word, Sweet spun on his heel and strode toward the main house, his gait fast and angry, leaving a palpable tension rippling to the field behind him. Gregory immediately grabbed Punch's arm, his face twisted with fear, his grip unexpectedly strong. "What have you done?" he whispered urgently. "You just signed your own death warrant, man." Punch pulled his arm free, his hand trembling. "I had to know," he murmured hollowly. Victor shook his head slowly, pale blue eyes heavy with grim understanding. "Knowing will kill you, Punch." Peter, the young Englishman, his face ashen, spoke barely above a whisper. "He's right. Sweet's going to tell Gwen. And Gwen's going to—" He stopped, unable to give voice to the terrifying possibilities that hung in the air. Samuel, the older African man, placed a firm yet gentle hand on Punch's shoulder. His expression was one of weary resignation. "You should run," he said quietly, his voice rough with age and hard-earned experience. "Tonight, before they come for you." But Punch did not run. Consumed by a strange blend of defiance and despair, he returned to his work. He cut the tobacco leaves and hung them in the barn with mechanical precision, his mind spinning with racing thoughts. He had asked a question. There was no taking it back. No way to unask it, whatever consequences awaited him. He had spoken the truth as he understood it, however dangerous, and the truth would demand its price. What Punch could not possibly have known in his desperate search for answers, what he could not even have imagined, was that his single audacious question had ignited a chain of events, a slow-burning fuse that would ultimately rewrite the laws of an entire continent. Because Robert Sweet, the overseer, did not go directly to Hugh Gwynn that afternoon. He went to someone else, someone far more powerful, far more dangerous. That night, beneath the cold, indifferent gaze of a nearly full moon, Robert rode with desperate urgency toward the plantation of William Evans, the man who had once owned Kofi. The journey, nearly 2 grueling hours along a rough, unpaved dirt road that tenuously linked the isolated plantations lining the winding James River, passed in a blur of pounding hooves and racing thoughts. Moonlight, stark and unforgiving, cast long, warped shadows across dense forests and sprawling fields, transforming familiar terrain into something eerie and alien. The air had cooled, filled now with the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful howl of a wolf, sounds that only sharpened Sweet's gnawing anxiety. He urged his horse onward, its hooves striking the packed earth in a frantic cadence, while his mind churned with the catastrophic implications unleashed by Punch's audacious question. William Evans was not merely a planter. He was a titan of the colony, immensely wealthy, deeply influential, and a prominent member of the colonial assembly. His connections reached far beyond his own fields, extending into the highest circles of Virginia society. His plantation ranked among the largest and most prosperous in the colony, boasting more than 200 acres of meticulously tended tobacco, a grand and imposing main house of brick and timber, and dozens of servant and laborers who formed a small, disciplined workforce. Evans, in his mid-50s, was tall and commanding, his graying hair carefully groomed, his face seemingly carved from stone, revealing little emotion. He was renowned for his sharp intellect, relentless ambition, and a ruthless pragmatism that often veered toward cruelty. He was equally infamous for his explosive temper and the swift, unforgiving manner in which he dealt with anyone, planter, servant, or laborer, who threatened his carefully constructed reputation or vast financial interests. Sweet and Evans spoke for too long, agonizing hours behind the heavy oak doors of Evans's opulent study. The room, usually a place of quiet contemplation, became a crucible of hushed voices and rising tension. No one but the two men knew the exact words exchanged, but house servants later whispered of raised voices, the muffled scrape of furniture being shoved aside, and at one jarring moment, the unmistakable crash of breaking glass. When Sweet finally emerged from the study, His face was deathly pale, his hands visibly trembling, a clear testament to the terror of what had been said. He mounted his horse in silence, his eyes wide and haunted, and rode back toward the Gwyn plantation without uttering a single word, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with dread. The very next morning, as the first hesitant rays of dawn painted the eastern sky, Hugh Gwyn received an unexpected and ominous visit. William Evans arrived not alone, but accompanied by two other powerful men. Thomas Warren, a formidable neighboring planter whose sprawling estate lay to the north, and Richard Bennett, a stern and influential member of the Colonial Council. The three men dismounted together, tying their horses to the fence outside Gwyn's main house, their presence casting a long, unsettling shadow over the otherwise tranquil morning. They spoke with Gwyn on the porch for more than an hour, their voices low and urgent, punctuated by tense, heavy silences. Eleanor Gwyn, pale and visibly shaken, watched the secretive meeting from an upstairs window, her heart pounding with a dread she could not name. Thomas Gwyn, the innocent boy whose striking resemblance to Kofi had ignited the entire crisis, was conspicuously absent, kept carefully out of sight. When the hushed meeting finally ended, Hugh Gwyn's face was ashen, his usual composure completely fractured. He immediately summoned Sweet to the porch, and the two men spoke in low, urgent tones, their heads bent close together, their words impossible to hear. Then, with chilling finality, Gwyn ordered that Punch, Gregory, and Victor be brought before him. That afternoon, the three servants were summoned to the main house. The sun beat down mercilessly as they stood in the dusty yard, heat radiating from the earth beneath their feet. Gwyn stood on the porch with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression utterly unreadable, a mask of cold detachment. Sweet stood beside him, his eyes, once sharp and calculating, now flat and devoid of warmth. "You three are leaving," Gwyn announced, his voice flat, stripped of emotion. "You're being transferred to a plantation in Maryland. You'll work there until your contracts are complete." Gregory stepped forward, confusion and anger flashing across his face. "Maryland? That's weeks away, Master Gwyn." "Why?" "Because I said so." Gwyn snapped sharply, cutting him off. "You leave tomorrow morning." Victor, ever calm and deliberate, spoke next, his voice steady despite the tension. "What of our contracts, Master Gwyn? We signed to work here, not in Maryland. Our terms are for this plantation." "Your contracts can be transferred," Gwyn replied dismissively. "It's perfectly legal. You'll work for a planter named John Dandy. He's expecting you." The name John Dandy lingered in the air like a death sentence. Punch felt a cold dread seep through him, deeper than the oppressive heat of the afternoon. This was no simple reassignment. It was exile, a calculated, deliberate banishment. And he knew with sickening certainty that it was the price of his question, his dangerous pursuit of truth. That night, the three men huddled together inside their cramped, dimly lit cabin. A single flickering candle cast warped, dancing shadows along the rough wooden walls. Gregory paced back and forth like a trapped animal, his face flushed with anger and raw fear. Victor sat on his bunk, his knife moving with calm, almost meditative precision as he carved into a scrap of wood, his expression distant, pale blue eyes unfocused. Punch sat on the dirt floor, his back pressed against the cold, unforgiving wall, his mind a frantic storm of racing thoughts, desperately searching for a way out. "We can't go to Maryland," Gregory said, his voice thick with desperation. "We'll never come back. They're sending us away to shut us up, to bury whatever Punch knows." "They're sending Punch away," Victor corrected quietly, his tone low and grim. "We're just collateral, Gregory, unfortunate witnesses." Gregory stopped pacing and turned toward Punch, his eyes wide with a desperate need for answers. "What did you see, Punch? What made you ask that question? What's so terrible they'd send all of us away?" Punch lowered his voice to little more than a whisper and finally spoke the impossible truth. He told them about Kofi, his beloved brother, and the undeniable, haunting resemblance between Kofi and young Thomas Gwyn. He spoke of the whispers he had gathered piece by piece, fragments of gossip that had slowly fused into something horrifying. He told them about Margaret Evans, the beautiful, lonely wife of the powerful planter, and the hushed rumors of her forbidden involvement with Kofi. He spoke of Kofi's sudden, suspicious death, officially recorded as fever, but whispered among the servants to be something far darker. And then, with chilling clarity, Punch laid bare the conclusion he had been forced to accept. Thomas Gwynn was not Hugh Gwynn's son. He was Kofi's, a child born of a forbidden union, a secret so dangerous it threatened to unravel the very foundations of colonial society. Gregory stared at him, his mouth hanging open, his face frozen in disbelief and dawning horror. Victor looked up from his carving, the knife forgotten in his hand, his pale blue eyes wide with shock. "Jesus Christ," Gregory whispered, the blasphemy slipping out before he could stop himself. "You're saying the boy is half African, that he's Kofi's son." "I'm saying the boy is my brother's son," Punch replied quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. Victor slowly shook his head, his gaze distant and troubled. "If that's true, Punch, and if anyone ever finds out, it would destroy the Gwynn family, the Evans family, and probably half the powerful planters in Virginia. It would be a scandal that would shake the colony to its core. That's why they're sending us away," Gregory said grimly. "They're going to bury this secret, and they're going to bury us with it, far away in Maryland, where no one will ever hear us." Punch looked at both men, his eyes burning with desperate resolve. "We have to run," he said firmly. "Tonight, before they can take us." Gregory hesitated for only a moment before nodding decisively. "Tonight." Victor sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle flame. After a long pause, he nodded as well. "Tonight," he echoed, his voice low and resolute. They vanished into the pre-dawn darkness with nothing but the worn clothes on their backs and a small, meager sack of cornmeal, their only provisions against a vast, unforgiving wilderness. They headed north, their fragile hope pinned to the distant promise of Maryland, a place they believed might offer freedom or at least anonymity among the growing population of free laborers. Their plan was simple, born entirely of desperation: reach Maryland, find work, and disappear. But they were not alone in the silent wilderness. Robert Sweet, ever vigilant, had anticipated their flight. He sent word ahead, his warnings carried by swift riders. By the time Punch, Gregory, and Victor, exhausted, hungry, and terrified, reached the poorly defined border separating Virginia from Maryland, a group of armed planters was already waiting. Their capture was swift, brutal, and utterly merciless. After days of relentless travel through dense forests and marshland, their bodies aching and their strength nearly spent, they were suddenly surrounded. 6 armed men on powerful horses emerged from the undergrowth, muskets glinting in the pale morning light, their faces hard and determined. There was no chance to run, no hope of fighting back. The odds were overwhelming. Their desperate bid for freedom ended in an instant. Punch, Gregory, and Victor were bound roughly with thick ropes, their hands wrenched painfully behind their backs. Their hopes collapsed as completely as their bodies. They were forced to march back to Virginia on foot, a humiliating, agonizing journey that stretched over 3 brutal days. They were given little food, barely enough to keep them alive, and even less water. Their throats burned with thirst. Their bodies teetered on the edge of collapse. By the time they reached Jamestown, the colonial capital, they were utterly spent. Their skin was raw and blistered from the relentless sun. Their clothes were torn and filthy. Their spirits were broken, and their hearts filled with profound, chilling terror. The colonial court convened on July 9th, 1640, a date that would be forever etched into the dark annals of American history. The courtroom was a small, claustrophobic wooden building near the bustling, dusty center of Jamestown. It was hot and airless, the oppressive humidity clinging to everything. Narrow, grimy windows offered little relief, allowing only thin slivers of weak, filtered light inside. The room was packed to suffocation. Planters were stern. Expectant faces stood shoulder to shoulder with curious servants and a scattering of townspeople who had come to witness justice. Or perhaps something far more sinister. Punch, Gregory, and Victor stood at the center of the room, their hands still bound, their clothes ragged, their bodies swaying slightly with exhaustion. Presiding over the court was Sir Francis Wyatt, the governor of Virginia himself. He was a stern, imposing figure, his graying hair carefully combed, his face seemingly carved from stone, revealing not the slightest trace of emotion. His presence alone radiated an absolute, chilling authority. Hugh Gwynn testified first. He stood before the court, his posture rigid, his voice calm and controlled. A man practiced in calculated deception. He described the three men as disobedient, ungrateful, and utterly untrustworthy servants. He described their flight in vivid detail, portraying them as rebellious and defiant, and with a chilling absence of remorse, he demanded that their terms of servitude be extended as just punishment for their transgression. The court listened in a profound, unsettling silence. The only sound was a steady, rhythmic scratching of the clerk's quill as he carefully recorded every damning word. Then Robert Sweet was called to testify. He walked in front of the courtroom with a slow, deliberate pace, his face carefully composed into a mask of practiced neutrality. He placed his hand on the worn leather Bible, the oath of grim formality. His testimony, delivered in a calm, measured tone, was precise and devastating in its implications. "The African John Punch," Sweet began, his voice clear and steady as it carried to the hushed room, "asked me a question concerning my master's son, a question that suggested impropriety. The word impropriety lingered in the air, heavy with meaning, a thin veil drawn over something far more scandalous. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, hushed whispers, sharp intakes of breath. Governor Wyatt leaned forward, his eyes narrowing to slits as he fixed Sweet with a penetrating stare. "What kind of question?" Wyatt demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Sweet hesitated, a long, agonizing pause, as if reluctant to give voice to something so volatile. Then, with a slow exhale, he spoke. He asked why the boy resembled his brother, a deceased African servant who once belonged to Mr. Evans. A palpable gasp swept the room. Wyatt's expression darkened, a storm gathering behind his eyes. He turned his gaze slowly toward Punch, his face cold, rigid, utterly devoid of sympathy. "Is this true?" Wyatt asked, his voice a low, menacing rumble. Punch, though gripped by fear, met the governor's stare. His voice was quiet, but steady, carried by a desperate, defiant courage. "Yes, sir. I asked because I wanted to know the truth." "The truth?" Wyatt repeated, the word dripping with contempt, as if it were itself an accusation. His eyes flicked briefly toward William Evans, seated in the front row, his face a carefully maintained mask of calm, betraying nothing. Then Wyatt's gaze snapped back Punch. "The truth is not yours to seek," he said, his tone edged with chilling finality. The courtroom erupted into a roar of murmurs and whispers, a wave of agitated voices washing over proceedings. Wyatt slammed his gavel again and again, his sharp commands cutting through the din until a strained silence was restored. He then turned to the other two defendants. "James Gregory and Victor," Wyatt declared, his voice cold and absolute, "you are guilty of the grave offense of running away from your master. For this crime, you are sentenced to an additional 4 years of servitude, to begin after the completion of your current contracts. Furthermore, you shall each receive 30 lashes, to be administered immediately, as a reminder of the consequences of defiance." Gregory's face drained a color, his eyes wide with shock and despair. Victor clenched his jaw so tightly a muscle jumped to his cheek, his eyes closing as he braced himself for the pain to come. Then, after a long, deliberate pause that stretched the tension in the room almost breaking, Wyatt turned fully toward Punch. The courtroom fell into a profound, breathless silence. Every eye fixed on the governor. "John Punch," Wyatt said, his voice slow and ceremonial, heavy with finality, "you are guilty of running away from your master. But your crime is far greater than flight alone. You have dared to question the honor of your betters. You have suggested impropriety where, by the order of our society, none may exist. By your audacious inquiry, you have threatened the very social order of this colony, a delicate balance we are bound to preserve. He paused, letting the words settle like a sentence already passed. For these grave offenses, Wyatt continued, for this unforgivable challenge to the established order, you are hereby sentenced to serve your master, Hugh Gwyn, for the remainder of your natural life. The courtroom erupted. A collective gasp rolled to the crowd, followed by a surge of shocked whispers. Punch stared at Wyatt, his mind reeling, unable to fully comprehend what he had heard. Life, not 4 years, like Gregory and Victor, not 10, not 20, but life, his entire existence, from that moment forward, bound irrevocably to servitude, without hope of freedom. Gregory and Victor were dragged away, their faces pale with terror and despair, their fates sealed. Punch remained standing at the center of the courtroom, his hands still bound, his thoughts collapsing into a chaotic maelstrom of disbelief and crushing hopelessness. He had asked a question, a simple, desperate question, and the answer, delivered with cold legal precision, had cost him everything: his freedom, his future, his very humanity. But the story did not end there. What transpired in that stifling Jamestown courtroom, the sentence pronounced against John Punch, was not merely punishment for a perceived offense. It was precedent, a legal cornerstone laid in the blood and despair of one man, a decision that would alter the course of an entire nation. And the question he dared to ask, the question that, in its profound simplicity, condemned a conscience and buried a scandalous truth, would echo across centuries, a silent, haunting testament to the insidious power of injustice. Punch was returned to Hugh Gwyn's plantation, but he was no longer the same man. The brutal whipping he received, 30 lashes delivered with cruel efficiency, the same number imposed on Gregory and Victor, left raw, burning welts across his back, the scars never fully healed, remaining as a constant, searing reminder of his punishment. Yet the deepest wounds were invisible. They were carved not into flesh, but into the core of his mind and soul. They came from the crushing knowledge that he would never again know freedom, that his life, from that moment forward, was permanently bound to the will of another human being. The fragile hope that had carried him to the horrors of the Middle Passage, through years of relentless labor in the tobacco fields, was extinguished completely, replaced by a cold, consuming despair. The other servants, once the companions in shared hardship, now avoided him. Their eyes slid away when he passed. Their voices dropped to whispers. They feared him, not for any violence or cruelty, but for what his fate represented. In John Punch's sentence, they saw a terrifying glimpse of their own possible future, a future in which the color of one's skin, rather than the terms of a contract, determined a person's destiny. Gregory and Victor, after enduring their own brutal punishments, were swiftly sent to work in a distant, isolated section of the plantation. The separation was deliberate. Punch rarely saw them again, and their former camaraderie faded into a painful memory. Hugh Gwyn treated Punch with cold, calculated indifference. He spoke to him only to issue curt commands, his eyes carefully avoiding Punch's face, as if refusing to acknowledge the humanity of the man he now owned for life. Robert Sweet, the overseer, watched Punch with an almost predatory focus. His gaze was constant, alert, as though he were forever expecting another escape attempt, waiting patiently for any mistake, any excuse, to justify further punishment. But Punch did not run again. Crushed by despair, he worked, he obeyed, and he watched. He watched the seasons turn, the tobacco plants rise and wither, the James River flow endlessly toward the sea. And above all, he watched Thomas Gwyn. Thomas Gwyn grew older, slowly transforming from quiet, bookish boy into a young man. By 1645, he was 19, tall, strong, his frame filled out, his movements confident and assured. He possessed his mother's pale, refined complexion and his father's determined, ambitious jaw. His education in England was complete, and he had returned to Virginia with the polished accent and cultivated manners of the English gentry. He was being carefully prepared to inherit his father's growing plantation, to become a planter in his own right, to marry advantageously into a prominent colonial family, and produce heirs who would carry the Gwynn name forward, securing the family's legacy in the New World. Yet his eyes, those dark, deep pools that carried an unsettling intensity, his long, elegant hands, and the subtle fluidity of his movements were unmistakable. They were Kofi's. Punch saw it every day, in fleeting glances, in unconscious gestures, and with every passing day, the impossible truth burned within him, a relentless internal fire. Why? Why did this young man, the heir of a respected English family, bear the unmistakable features of Punch's dead African brother? And why, in the merciless logic of colonial justice, had that question cost Punch's freedom his very life? The answer came slowly, in fragments, pieced together over years of silent observation and whispered revelations. It came from older servants, those who had once worked on Evans' plantation, those who remembered the past with clarity sharpened by fear and resentment. It came from overheard conversations between planters, voices lowered, words chosen with care, yet revealing enough for Punch's watchful mind to connect the dots. The truth formed like a grotesque mosaic, piece by piece, each fragment more chilling than the last. Margaret Evans, the beautiful, lonely wife of the powerful William Evans, had indeed been profoundly isolated. Her husband, consumed by ambition and the relentless pursuit of wealth and influence, was perpetually absent. He traveled frequently to England on business, attended endless meetings of the Colonial Assembly in Jamestown, and visited neighboring plantations to negotiate complex deals and forge strategic alliances. Margaret remained alone in the grand, imposing main house, its vast rooms echoing with emptiness. Her only constant companions were the silent house servants. Kofi, Punch's brother, had been assigned to work within that house. He was intelligent, articulate, and possessed a quiet dignity that distinguished him from the field laborers. He tended the expansive gardens, repaired fine furniture with careful precision, and carried out the countless small tasks that kept the household functioning. In her loneliness, Margaret noticed him. Over time, their interactions, once formal and restrained, deepened. What began as quiet conversation evolved into something far more intimate, far more dangerous. Their relationship, born of isolation and human need, was brief, intensely secret, and fraught with peril. It violated every rigid social law of the colony, a transgression that threatened to destroy not only their lives, but the lives of many others if discovered. When Margaret realized she was pregnant, she was seized by blind panic. At first, she claimed the child was her husband's, conceived during one of his rare visits home. But she knew, with sickening certainty, that the timing did not align. The dates betrayed the lie. So, in a desperate attempt to preserve her reputation and avert a catastrophic scandal, she made a chilling decision. She would send the child, her newborn son, to England to be raised by distant relatives far from the prying eyes of Virginia society, far from the damning truth of his parentage. And she would ensure, with every fiber of her being, that no one, absolutely no one, would ever uncover the secret. But Kofi knew, and when he finally understood the horrifying truth, when he realized that his son, his own flesh and blood, had been cruelly taken from him and shipped across the ocean, he confronted Margaret. It was a fatal mistake. Margaret, consumed by primal terror that her carefully guarded secret would be exposed, that her world would collapse, confessed everything to her husband, William Evans. And William Evans, a man of immense power, unyielding pride, and ruthless pragmatism, made certain that Kofi would never speak of it again. Kofi's death, officially recorded as a result of a common fever, was no natural occurrence. It was murder meticulously disguised as illness. His body was buried hastily in an unmarked grave at the edge of the Evans plantation. The house servants, those forced to prepare his body for burial, whispered in terrified voices about faint bruises on his neck, about the way his eyes, wide and frozen, seemed locked in an expression of unspeakable terror. But no one dared speak openly. No one dared challenge the official account. Fear of William Evans and the unspoken threat of sharing Kofi's fate silenced them all. And when John Punch, driven by an unyielding need for truth, dared to ask his question, when he threatened to unravel the carefully constructed lie, the powerful men of the colony acted swiftly. Gwen, Evans, Sweet, and their influential allies ensured that Punch would never again be free to speak. They manipulated the fragile legal system, twisting its principles to silence him. And in doing so, they created something new, something far more insidious. A form of bondage no longer rooted in contract, but in race itself. Just when it seems the depths of this colonial horror cannot sink any lower, the story reveals still darker layers of deceit and injustice. If this forgotten history grips you, if its weight settles uneasily in your chest, share this story with someone who, like you, is drawn to the darkest corners of the past. Support the channel, subscribe, and stay with us as we continue uncovering the truths history tried to bury. The year is 1650. A decade has passed since that fateful day in the Jamestown courtroom. 10 long, brutal years since John Punch was condemned to a life without end, a life without freedom. He is now 40 years old. His body, once lean and powerful, is worn and stooped from relentless, soul-crushing labor in the tobacco fields. His spirit, though not broken, has been hardened by the constant grinding weight of injustice, by the ever-present despair of permanent servitude. His hands, once skilled and precise, are now gnarled and scarred, the skin thick and calloused from years of gripping hoes and cutting tobacco leaves. His back, once straight and proud, is permanently bent, shaped by endless hours stooping over fields. His face, once youthful, is deeply lined, etched by sun, wind, and suffering too deep for words. Yet through all of it, through the physical pain and emotional torment, he has not forgotten. The truth, the impossible and dangerous truth, remains alive within him, a burning ember, a silent, defiant flame. One evening, as the sun, a fiery orb, sank slowly toward the western horizon, casting long, warped shadows across the tobacco fields, Punch was approached by a young servant. The boy, no more than 16, was named Samuel. He had arrived at the plantation 2 years earlier, a fresh-faced English orphan who, like so many others, had sold himself into servitude to escape the grinding poverty of London streets. Samuel was unusually curious, with a sharp intelligence that shone in his bright, questioning eyes. He possessed a rare, almost reckless courage, a willingness to ask questions, to challenge what everyone else accepted in silence, qualities that, painfully, reminded Punch of himself many years before. "Mr. Punch," Samuel whispered, his voice trembling with awe and fear. "Is it true? Did you really ask why the master son looked like your brother?" Punch stared toward the horizon, where the sun had dwindled to a thin band orange. Slowly, he turned to the boy. He studied Samuel's earnest face for a long, silent moment. Then he nodded. "I did." Samuel's face filled with disbelief. "And they made you a slave for life just for asking a question?" "Yes." Punch said quietly, his voice flat, stripped of emotion by years of buried pain. Samuel's eyes filled with tears, reflecting the burning sky. "That's not right," he whispered. "That's not justice, Mr. Punch." Slowly and deliberately, he reached out and rested a gnarled, callous hand on the boy's slender shoulder. The weight of that hand, heavy with decades of labor, loss, and sorrow, seemed to carry a lifetime of unspoken truths. "No," Punch said quietly, his voice rough with age and resignation. "It's not, but it's the world we live in now, Samuel, the world they have made." Samuel looked up at him, his face pale in the fading light, his young eyes filled with desperate, unspoken plea. "Will it always be this way, Mr. Punch? Will it always be this way for us?" Punch did not answer. He couldn't. He did not know. But he knew one thing with an absolute, chilling certainty. The question he had asked, the dangerous, truth-seeking question that had cost him everything, would not die with him. It was a question that would be asked again and again by those who came after him, by those who would suffer beneath the very system his sentence had helped to create. And one day, perhaps in some distant, unimaginable future, someone would finally find the answer. Someone would finally speak the truth that had been so violently suppressed. That night, as the last vestiges of twilight faded in the vast, star-filled canvas of colonial sky unfolded above him, Punch lay on his rough straw pallet in the cramped, silent cabin. He stared into the darkness of the unseen ceiling, listening to the familiar sound of the plantation settling into its uneasy sleep. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the soft night breeze, the slow creak of the cabin walls. His mind, however, was anything but quiet. It churned with memories, ghosts, and regret. He thought of Kofi, his beloved brother, the intelligent, vibrant man torn from his side, a brother he had lost not once, but twice, first to the slave traders, then to the planters' dark conspiracy. He thought of the son Kofi had never known, the boy who carried his brother's features, the boy who walked among them, a living testament to a forbidden love and a brutal murder. He thought of Thomas Gwynn, the young man who, in complete innocence, bore a physical legacy of a truth too dangerous to be spoken, a truth that will remain hidden from him forever. And he thought endlessly of the question, the simple, deadly question that had shattered his world, irrevocably altered his life, and in a cruel twist of fate, laid the foundation for slavery in English America. Why does the young master look exactly like my brother? The answer, Punch knew, was buried beneath layers of secrets and lies, carefully constructed by men driven by fear, pride, and an unyielding desire to protect their reputations and their fragile social order. The answer was written not in ink, but in law, in the cold, legal pronouncements of Virginia's court records that had condemned him to lifelong servitude. It was enshrined in the precedent that would be invoked again and again to justify the enslavement of millions, to strip them of their humanity, to reduce them to property. The answer, in its most visceral form, flowed through Thomas Gwynn's veins. The undeniable blood of an African man and an English woman, joined in a union the colony, bound to its rigid racial hierarchy, could never acknowledge, never accept, never forgive. And perhaps most profoundly, the answer lived in silence. The suffocating silence that fell whenever John Punch's name was spoken. The silence that surrounded the events of 1640. The silence that marked Kofi's unclaimed grave, a mute testament to a life deliberately erased. A silence that would linger for centuries, casting a heavy shadow over one of the darkest foundations of American history. John Punch died in 1655, still a servant, still bound to Hugh Gwynn's plantation. His life ended exactly as the law had defined it 15 years earlier, in perpetual servitude. His death, like his life, was recorded with chilling brevity in the colonial register. A single stark line, heavy with omission, John Punch, African, deceased. There was no mention of his age, no cause of death, no acknowledgement of his life, his question, or the profound tragedy that had consumed him. In the official record, his existence was reduced to a footnote, a statistic. He was buried, as was customary for those of his station, in an unmarked grave at the edge of the plantation, in a small, desolate plot where other servants, European and African alike, were laid to rest. There was no ceremony, no eulogy, no word spoken over his body, no marker, no stone, no cross. Within a year, Virginia grass had grown thick and wild over the disturbed earth, erasing any sign of where he lay. It was as if John Punch, the man who dared ask, had never existed at all. But his legacy did not vanish. Buried in silence, it endured. The legal precedent set by his case, the distinction of lifelong servitude imposed upon an African, while Europeans guilty of the same offense received only extended contracts, became the insidious foundation of slavery in English America. Within a single generation, the Virginia Assembly, influenced by the framework established by Punch's sentencing, began passing increasingly restrictive laws. These statutes systematically codified race-based slavery, making it hereditary, permanent, and inseparably tied to African descent. By 1700, less than 60 years after Punch stood before the court, slavery had become the undisputed engine of the colonial economy, a brutal system of exploitation and oppression that would endure for more than 2 centuries, shaping the identity and destiny of an entire nation. The question John Punch asked, the question that cost him his freedom, would be answered not with truth, but with chains, with whips, with the systematic dehumanization of millions and centuries of unimaginable suffering. Thomas Gwynn, the young man whose striking resemblance to Kofi had ignited this entire tragic chain of events, grew to adulthood, inherited his father's prosperous plantation, and lived a long, outwardly successful life. He married advantageously, taking as his wife the daughter of another wealthy and influential planter, further cementing his family's standing within colonial society. He had children of his own, heirs who proudly carried the Gwynn name, children who would never know the devastating truth about their lineage, never learn the African man whose blood, through a cruel twist of fate, flowed in their veins. Thomas rose to become a respected member of the Colonial Assembly, a man of influence and authority, regarded as a pillar of Virginia society. Whether he ever sensed the truth of his origins, whether some faint, unsettling whisper reached him in moments of private doubt, remains unknown. If he knew, he never spoke of it. The secret, like a venomous serpent, died with him, buried as deeply and irrevocably as John Punch's unmarked grave. Robert Sweet, the overseer whose testimony had sealed Punch's fate, vanished from colonial records sometime around 1652. His ultimate end remains a mystery. Some whisper that he drank himself into an early grave, haunted by the question Punch had asked and by the knowledge of the role he had played in forging a new and terrible form of bondage. Others believe he left Virginia entirely, unable to live beneath the crushing weight of his conscience, unable to face the man he had helped condemn. His disappearance, like so many uncomfortable truths of the era, was simply absorbed into the vast, unspoken silence of colonial life. Hugh Gwynn, Punch's master, continued to prosper. His plantation expanded, his wealth grew, and he became, by all accounts, one of the most successful and respected planters in Virginia. He never spoke of John Punch. He never mentioned the infamous trial. He never acknowledged the pivotal, chilling role he had played in establishing a legal precedent that would shape American slavery. When he died in 1663, he was buried with full honors in the Jamestown churchyard, his grave marked by imposing stone praising his contributions to the growing colony. Eleanor Gwynn, Hugh's wife, lived until 1670. She spent her final years largely confined to the main house, rarely venturing outside as her health steadily declined, perhaps under the immense, unspoken weight of the secret she carried. She never spoke of Margaret Evans. She never mentioned Kofi. She never acknowledged the devastating truth that, as a woman living within those walls, she must have known, or at least suspected. When she died, she was buried beside her husband, and the secrets, like centuries-old dust, were laid to rest with her. William Evans, the powerful planter who had owned Kofi, continued serving in the Colonial Assembly until his death in 1659. He remained a formidable and influential figure, actively shaping Virginia's laws and policies, a man whose voice carried immense authority. He never spoke of Kofi. He never acknowledged the African servant who had worked in his household. He never admitted the forbidden relationship between his wife and the man he had ensured would be silenced forever. His reputation remained intact. His legacy as a powerful, respected planter secure. And the question itself, why does a young master look exactly like my brother, was buried deep within colonial archives, reduced to forgotten whisper in dusty court records, lost to collective memory for centuries. It remained there, a silent testament to a truth deemed too dangerous to speak, until historians, patiently poring over faded documents, uncovered the records and painstakingly reconstructed the story of the man who dared to ask it. In 1640, the Virginia court, in its chilling judgment, sentenced John Punch to lifelong servitude, creating the first legal precedent for race-based slavery in English America. Within 2 decades, The Virginia Assembly, building upon that insidious foundation, passed a series of laws that formally codified slavery, making it hereditary, permanent, and inseparably tied to African descent. By the dawn of the 18th century, slavery had become the unquestioned backbone of the colonial economy, a brutal system of exploitation and oppression that would endure for more than 200 years, leaving an indelible wound on the soul of the nation. The question John Punch asked in his desperate search for truth was never answered in his lifetime, but it echoed silently through the centuries. It was asked by millions who were enslaved, denied their freedom, treated as property rather than as human beings. It was asked by abolitionists who fought relentlessly against the institution of slavery, by soldiers who shed blood in the crucible of the Civil War, by civil rights activists who marched and struggled for equality. And in a profound sense, it is still being asked today by historians uncovering forgotten lives like Punch's, by descendants searching for the truth of their ancestry, by a nation still wrestling with the painful legacy of slavery and the enduring question of what freedom truly means. John Punch's story is not merely a historical anecdote. It is a haunting reminder that history is shaped not only by the powerful and the famous, but by ordinary people whose lives were irrevocably altered by decisions made above them, whose voices were silenced, whose stories were deliberately buried. It is proof that the past is never truly past, that the questions we ask today are, at their core, the same questions asked centuries ago, and that the search for truth and justice is a journey that humanity has never finished. This chilling story, unearthed in forgotten archives of colonial Virginia, shows how a single audacious question can, in its terrifying simplicity, alter the course of history. It reveals that the pursuit of truth can come at an unimaginable cost, and that the legacy of injustice can endure for centuries. What do you think of this story? Do you believe justice was ever truly served for John Punch? Should the devastating truth about Thomas Gwynn's origins have been revealed, regardless of the consequences? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. And if this story has gripped you, if the shadows of this history linger in your mind, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who, like you, is drawn to the darkest and most unsettling mysteries of the past. We'll see you in the next video as we continue to uncover the forgotten narratives that shape our